Hi, welcome to the September 2 meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group. We don't have any fixed pre-announced agenda for today's meeting, so we're going to hold it anyway, and this is just open forum, birds of a feather discussion for anything people want to talk about, open forum Q&A. Before I kicked off the meeting officially, Michael is joining us and wanted to make an announcement about the VMware desktop hypervisor fusion mode. So I'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. Yeah, it's been a while. I've been, kind of bogged down trying to get a lot of the crazy work that we've been doing on the desktop side, through the gears, so to speak, this year. And our big project has been trying to deliver a desktop hypervisor on Apple Silicon products. And so the Apple Silicon is a unique set of challenges. It's ARM based. It's not, it's ARM in the middle and then like a whole bunch of Apple stuff wrapped around it. And it's really awesome tech. We're very impressed with it. So, our stack has been very much tied to the x86 architecture. And we've been making inroads in ARM with our Fling project that we have with ESXi on ARM. And so we leveraged a lot of the work. A lot of the folks that worked on that are also working on some of the core components of Fusion for Apple Silicon. And we've just, as of, essentially last night, launched our formal private tech preview program. That's an invite-only program, and we're keeping the discussion sort of closed. We plan to do this for a couple of weeks just to make sure that some of our biggest customers and our close partners and friends have earlier access to when we open it up to the public, which we plan to do in the next few weeks. So wanted to extend an invitation to folks inside of SIG VMware, and folks listening to this, feel free to either fire me an email at mroy@vmware.com or the Fusion beta team at fusion-beta@vmware and request an invite. We'll be happy to add you to it. The limitation right now is, again, everything's just sort of self-contained inside the community. We're really confident about where we're at with it. We just wanted to try something a little different this year. So the private community, we will see evolve into like a continuous ongoing kind of a beta, where we'll have sort of releases there, and then we'll have like a public tech preview, which will have releases that'll happen slightly after that. So it's like an alpha and a beta kind of a channel, if you want to look at it that way. So we're super excited. Things are working great. Linux across the board. BSD we've got working as well. Of course, we have licensing issues with Windows. Microsoft does not make available a Windows license for ARM other than the tech preview, or I should say the insider program. And the insider program specifically says that it's only supported in devices that already come with Windows on ARM, which is not an Apple Silicon chip. But the thing about booting a Windows operating system is it's not very different from booting a Linux operating system. And so while we can't convert like a VHD, which is what you get when you download it from Microsoft, there are ways of creating ISOs, and the other guest OS type will probably boot that, but it's just not supported, and there are no drivers, or we haven't done tools or anything. But on the tool side, we actually have OpenVM tools compiled for Linux in the in 11.3 and for ARM. So you can build that from source for any distro. But we also make available Debs for Debian 11 or Debian 10 and Ubuntu 20.04 and 21.04. So and of course FreeBSD actually has it in the ports repository. So I don't know if it's in package manager yet, but it's definitely in ports, so it can be built. It takes it's BSD, so it takes a while to build it, but that's BSD. Yeah, so super excited. We're at the 11th hour. We've worked a lot with the community. Parallels was already sort of out, and that's fine and dandy. They have a very sort of closed ecosystem. We bring our tools into the Linux kernel. We have drivers that are shipping in 5.14. We have OpenVM tools, which are picked up by the distributions and delivered that way. So our model is just a little different, and we had to bring the community all sort of together at once for this all to, for the gears to all connect. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying we're ready to go. And if folks want some early access in a confidential way, get in touch with myself, or I think Steve, you put something in the chat there to reach out through the SIG.
No, I just put a link to our agenda notes document. If you want, we can go drop your contact information there.
Yeah, sure. That'll be great.
I'll fill it in later. I didn't paste it in right now. Or if you're a member of the group, you should be able to click on that link and do it yourself. Just, I want to make sure I understand that. So this is a desktop hypervisor for the ARM-based Apple laptops. In terms of the VMs it runs, these VMs are also going to be running in ARM. It doesn't compose a way to do x86 VMs on top of the physical ARM hardware, I assume.
Right. So there's no, we're VMware, not EMware. So we are virtualizing, we're not emulating. And so a lot of folks really want x86 stuff, but the limitations that we have are like Apple doesn't provide the APIs to do that. They have Rosetta, and Rosetta does a lot of x86 emulation, but it doesn't do virtualization specifically. And we've done, yes, Chris, we're talking about Fusion. We had emulation for like the longest time. We had this thing called binary translation, and it was what originally created the hypervisor in the first place, way back in like 99. And that binary translation it's slow. If you try to do world switches, it's like you have to switch it in like, a full stack of memory around back and forth. And it was just really hard to maintain. And over the years, all those features that we needed that for ended up getting baked into the CPU itself. And our relationship with Intel continued to get stronger, and everybody was selling chips and stuff like that. So we abandoned that, or we didn't abandon, but we end of life that emulation stack years ago. There's actually there's a tombstone on campus if folks are interested. And but yeah, so it's the possibility of doing emulation, it's going to take us 2 years if we wanted to try and do that again, and it just isn't.
And I imagine it inherently, because of almost the physics of it, it's always going to be slow. They do those emulations for things like ancient video games where they didn't expect to have a lot of horsepower, so they still work okay. But kind of, I think, in my experience, one of the most common use cases for Fusion is to run the real Windows Office suite or something like that on top of a Mac, and it is
or in the case of Windows, you've got WSL is great, but needing a full Linux desktop for doing day-to-day Kubernetes stuff, I think is a big use case driver as well. So like we have things like the Docker machine driver, so you can install that to get Docker and to drive Minikube, and we also have vctl or vctl, which is basically a containerd front end, and all those things avoid all of the Docker licensing things that recently have been kind of making noise.
Okay, so that the vctl and everything is working in this preview then. That's cool.
Well, I was going to say on x86, that's where we're at. So we haven't got that in ARM yet. Basically, the limitation right there. So I own the Docker machine Docker machine driver VMware repo and the project on GitHub. And the big challenge I have right there is basically the boot to Docker doesn't exist for x8 or only exists for x86. And personally, I've been focused on trying to get tech preview ready to go. So it's one of those things we have to get to it. And that's sort of the linchpin, because everything else it compiles. It's just having that, like, where the environment actually lives is the issue.
So if I wanted to run Kubernetes on this tech preview, what is a way that does work? Can I run kind on it or stand up a Linux VM and just install Kubernetes inside that Linux VM, or what would you recommend?
It would be exactly that. You would stand up, a Linux VM. So we're supporting Ubuntu, everything from 2004 onward, and Fedora 34, 35, and Photon 4 is supported as well, and then FreeBSD 13. So anything that can run Kubernetes in a virtual machine is going to work. And so there's you can do it without having to install any of the other components, like standing up a VM, not doing anything else, installing Kubernetes all the dependencies. That'll all work and be just fine. If you wanted to have like 3D, or I should say 2D graphics, you need to install tools, and you need to install the newer version of the Linux kernel. So part of the process right now is installing mainline 5.14, which has our graphics drivers into it, and then either building tools from source or running it the D package installers for Ubuntu and Debian. So, but you don't need to do that to just get like a Linux server operating system running. You could take Ubuntu server 2110 leading edge, fire it up. Way to go. you could probably even do that thing where if you install Docker, you can do like an environment variable to if you have like the local Docker daemon installed with like Homebrew, you should be able to point the environment variable to the VM and use it sort of where the Docker engine itself is running inside of a VM. And you can do that with like Minikube on x86 today.
Great.
Does
I guess
it
I
work with like?
Oh, I
Does
was
it
just
work
going to
with
say
the
I
OVAs
monopolized
like
the
on
question.
ESXi?
Sorry,
Does
Scott,
it
what was
work
that?
with? Does it work with like the OVAs that were built for ESXi on ARM in the same VM tools? Is it the same stack? So if I have like currently I have 20 Raspberry Pis with ESXi running K3s on them in my house, would that work here as well in Fusion?
It should. There are some weird issues with like OVF tool. And I haven't personally tested that use case, but as far as like the hardware version and tools, those are the same.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, it would be great to know if that works or not. Like I know there was some issues with OVA import export, and that had to do also with sort of remoting, where it was you can't like drag and drop. You can connect to a remote vSphere, but I don't think you can like drag and drop workloads back and forth because OVA tool or OVF tool hasn't been built for ARM yet.
Okay. Yeah, I know. Moving between ESXi ARMs, you have to export it manually and then import it manually from the UI.
Yeah,
As a separate file. But
I would definitely expect like a VMX and a VMDK to boot. Whether or not the OVA package does is a different question.
Awesome.
So any other questions for Michael on the new Fusion preview or even desktop hypervisors in general? Okay, well, thanks, Michael. I see we've got a few other people joined, and for those of you who joined late, this is no fixed agenda, but it's just open forum for Q&A or nominating discussion topics you want to throw out there. And I see Bryson has joined us. Haven't seen you in a long time, so welcome, Bryson.
Thanks.
Yeah, I hope we don't have dead air here. So who's got something that they are curious
I'm
about?
wondering on for the persistent volumes, there's what you guys suggest as the best practices for the shoot. I'm blanking out. The vSAN rules.
Yeah, unfortunately, Miles, the co-chair of this group, couldn't make this meeting today, and he's the authority on it. Certainly, well, you probably already know this, that if you're dealing vSAN, you definitely want to be using the CSI driver for VMware as opposed to other solutions. Although, theory, I suppose you could use vSAN to host something like NFS and use a generic one. I don't know why you'd want to.
Well, what I mean is like vSAN, I have to go pull up a site for me to remember the exact title of it, but you can set up, for example, your vSAN, hey, if I have one of the hosts down, don't configure any new disks, right? It's trying to protect the storage. So the issue I've seen with things like that is if you are using persistent volumes that are getting dynamically created, is if one of the hosts is down, then it won't be able to create the volume because it is creating a disk on the back end. And but we have some settings that aren't the default that do that to prevent issues. And so I'm just curious what maybe the best practice default rules for vSAN are when using persistent volumes.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not authoritative enough to try to answer that. Is anybody else?
So
on the call?
it may not be an answer for now, but that may be a
Yeah,
discussion
I'll
for future topics.
okay, I'll write it down in the notes and we'll try to get you an answer. But I don't have enough experience to answer it. There may be somebody else on the call who's been involved with that before who can chime in here.
So my only experience with the CSR driver up till now is through TKGS, through vSphere with Tanzu, right? And in that case, through basically a storage class, a particular vSAN storage policy is associated with a Kubernetes storage class. So that's the link. And at least there, and I believe this is simply just the standard functionality of the CSI, you can have many different vSAN storage policies. And you can have
that's
link
what I
them
was
to
looking
many
for,
different.
that storage policies. That's what I was couldn't come up with that word.
So by default in vSAN, I mean, you probably want every object protected by at least a mirror. I mean, that's the default, right? So the default vSAN storage policy is just to mirror every object. You can choose to not have certain objects mirrored, and in which case just RAID 0, right? But that would be pretty unsafe, but there are probably use cases for that, especially if you want to save storage. But you can have, I mean, so vSAN storage policies are simply a vSphere construct, right? It doesn't really have any associate, it doesn't really have anything to do with the CSI initially. And then in the CSI, you simply make Kubernetes storage classes, which are linked to specific vSAN storage policies. So whatever properties those vSAN storage policies have, that's what your persistent volume will be created as, an object with those properties. But you know, it's kind of it's happening on the back end, right? It's a vSphere thing. It's not a Kubernetes thing. It's simply the way vSAN handles how to store those objects. So you have as many options to do whatever you want as as vSAN has options.
Yeah, I get that. I guess what I'm asking is, what are the recommended options for using persistent volumes? So it finds like, hey, you want to make sure you have this set up for your storage policy, or this thing, hey, it may provide additional safety, but you'll have failures. You have more issues like creating persistent volumes if you have your storage policy set up this way. I'm looking for more of that best practice kind of information.
Yeah, I think it's one of the hardest things to do a best practices on that, because it really also comes down to what type of application it is and what type of persistency you're needing there for that specific application. Because just for example, a persistent volume for RabbitMQ is very different than a persistent volume for Postgres. If you were to lose the persistency of a RabbitMQ queue, in many cases, again, that depends how you're using your queues and all of that, but maybe much less important or much less impactful than if you lost your entire database. So like, it really comes down to what types of applications you want. And what at least I'm starting to see more and more being done is creating storage policies, not necessarily that are relevant to vSAN. They're obviously using the vSAN capabilities in order to do it, but creating a Postgres specific storage policy, a RabbitMQ specific storage policy, a MySQL specific storage policy that would be according to the best practices that usually the database operators out there that exist in open source and commercial offerings and whatever have their best practices of how that persistent data should be stored. Sometimes that exists less for vSphere, but it's very easy to correlate. Like if you look at guides that people have done for running on AWS, on EKS, for example, most of the settings you can set in a storage policy for vSAN, you can set for EBS. CSI as well. So looking at that, you can kind of pretty easily correlate examples that people have done or the blog posts on how to run Postgres correctly on Kubernetes, and the CSI, based storage policy there do the same thing on a vSphere side. So it's more of an incident by incident base rather than a blanket best practice from my experience, at least.
Yeah, we
And,
go for it. Jeff. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go for it.
Yeah, Scott, just for my information, I mean, the kind of storage policy differences I'd expect are things like, I want more striping because I'm going to get more, I don't know, read or write hits on a particular storage object. Is that the kind of stuff you're talking about, or are there more exotic kinds of things you'd want to do with a storage object that's more like? Because I don't know what EBS can do, for example.
So there are things on like limiting IOPS or setting, priorities, quality of service that you can do. There are things around, how many replicas you want, striping, things like that. There are also different settings that you can set for like encryption. vSAN, especially now with in vSphere 7, where we have the built-in KMS in vSphere. Or maybe that was 7 update 2. I don't remember which release that came. But you can do also vSAN encryption for first-class disks. So certain applications say don't run encrypted because the performance is going to affect me. Other ones you may need encryption because you need encryption for some compliance or because you want encryption. So it's different settings like that as well, not just the RAID. But that is something that also definitely is one of the key factors.
And so this is the kind of information that I'm talking about, where it may not be, and obviously it's not the same best practices defaults for everything. But if you're new to this and you just take the default that's out there, you may run into issues that other people have already figured out. So if we can have like a place to kind of centralize on, hey, here's some best practices we've found for this type of setup or something like that. We've ran into just so many issues lately that we're trying to just move away from those applications that are using the persistent volumes, because the persistent volumes are just causing the downtime. And so like we have another example. So this is moving away from what we were just talking, but still along the persistent volume side, where the host will become disconnected from the vCenter, and Kubernetes wants to move the pod to a new node. And so it tells the vCenter to unmount the volume from a VM that was on a host that became disconnected, but since it's disconnected, it can't unmount it, and therefore it can't mount it on another node that's on a different host. So that's causing some issues as well.
So it would seem like for that to happen, it's almost like the storage network connectivity is not isolated, but perhaps still good. Yet the control plane connectivity is still good. That's an interesting challenge.
Like the VM's good. The VM could be still good, but for some reason the host is disconnected from the vCenter. And so it can't talk to the hypervisor to tell it to do anything on those VMs.
All I can say is that that's a known issue and that it's being worked on.
I don't even know how you fix that if it can't connect to it. Like,
there's different things, and it's an overall a CSI question. It's come up a lot in Cluster API because of how Cluster API is a mutable infrastructure and coming up and down of nodes. It's a bunch of things around how to do the force mount to a different VM and things like that. It's not only affecting vSphere, it's affecting a lot of CSIs. vSphere specifically, the issue is more on your side because you also are managing the infrastructure in
You're correct. It
AWS?
is. It's the same issue that you can't mount it to the new storage until it's released from, or the new VM until it's released from the old VM. So we have the same similar situation with our other cloud providers. Like we run into
Right.
that similar issue.
And there, the only real solution with that with vCen is if you have vCen Enterprise, you can use file services and do read write many pods and only connect them to one. And then because it's file service, it could connect to multiple nodes. And then you do have a kind of solution there. It's again, it's a kind of workaround because you really want to read write once persistent volume, but to get around that issue until something is solved in the upstream CSI, driver, the workaround for that would be to do file services and then do persistent volumes that are NFS backed by vSAN file services. And then that would be able to be mounted to a additional pod on a different node without issues.
I'd have to think if that would work in this one. I mean, obviously that wouldn't work in a lot of situations, but this situation, it may work. So.
But yeah, no, and I agree with you that having something even in like the vSphere CSI repo, or a blog post or whatever it is, but having somewhere with a bunch of like best practice examples of storage policies would be nice. I know there are some examples in the CSI repo, but they're more just like quick getting started examples. That definitely would be something that would be awesome to have some more examples of what the best practices are for specific applications. I'm not sure if that really belongs in the vSphere CSI or more of a separate repo that's kind of, collaborated by people from the different database vendors, different, application vendors that, their software is utilizing the persistent volumes. But that would definitely be a helpful resource, I know, for a lot of people that I deal with as well.
Yeah, this sounds like a good idea. That you're right, it might be broader and belong in the Kubernetes storage seg because it's cross-cutting against different vendors for different storage and different apps. But I'll write down a note because I'm always looking for topics to bring up for these user group meetings or even KubeCon sessions in the maintainer track. So this looks like a great opportunity to make the world of Kubernetes a better place by, it sounds like we might even have to figure out what the best practices are before we document them. I know those best practices could vary quite a bit too. I think, Bryson, I know you do a fair amount of stuff that's on-prem versus in public clouds. And it strikes me that what you might do in an on-prem environment could be quite different from what you do when you were building things out in a public cloud.
So, Robert, you asked a question if this was one of the issues at the top of that page, and that page describes the issue as multi-attach error for read-write only block volume when node VM is shut down before pods are evicted and volumes are detached from node VM. So that issue is like, hey, and I do experience this. I have experienced this, like if the node goes down hard before Kubernetes is able to evict it, it won't detach the VM or detach the storage. So that's one example of it. It won't be able to mount that volume on another node. But this is a little different in that if it's the same reason that it can't mount it on the other node. It can't mount it on the other node because it's already mounted somewhere, and it can't unmount it the other place to mount it on the new node. Does that make sense? This is a little different cause. This is just saying, hey, vCenter can't even talk to the host to tell the VM to unmount it. But yeah, similar outcome.
Yeah, because it seems that Kubernetes is currently missing some kind of unlocking mechanism around this. There's these, it has no way to detect whether, I mean, it seems, I mean, this sounds to me, this is all new to me, by the way. It sounds to me like a lack of some kind of, exclusive locking release or something.
Well, I mean, essentially just relies on the hypervisor, whatever cloud you're in, to actually do the unmounting. And if it's not unmounted, it can't mount it. It doesn't matter where. So this says for C. Wait, was this for vSphere? We have the same thing issue with like Azure. So we have that, and that's what kind of Scott brought up, is like sometimes we get these same issues in Azure where it won't mount to the new one because Azure isn't unmounting it from the old VM.
Yeah, these sorts of things have been alive out there in Kubernetes for a couple of years now, and in some cases, they're stalled and stuck, and in others, they might eventually get consistent, but that background process of achieving this eventual consistency is so slow that the outage takes so long that for practical purposes for your app, it might be perceived as an outage anyway. If this thing took tens of minutes or an hour before it was able to recover from this, for practical purposes for your app, could be that it's the same as just being outright broke. Nobody is willing to give it that long. I'm not sure there are perfect solutions for all of these, but I think I'm going to try to get together with Miles and plan a future session on at least trying to assemble best practices to the extent we can do it. And maybe we'll reach out to others in the Kubernetes storage sake to get outside contribution that goes beyond just vSphere here.
Yeah, and probably additional things like common issues you're going to see. So another issue we've seen is, say something happens on the network. We'll just say a network upgrade. Let's say someone's upgrading the network. The network isn't, it should be up the whole time, but maybe for some reason it wasn't. Then you run into issues with vSAN as well. And so we've ran into some issues where if the network wasn't as good or wasn't in ideal shape, then vSAN wasn't in ideal shape. And eventually our VMs would mark themselves read-only file systems to prevent any damage.
Mm-hmm.
And then the downside there is then they stay that way until you reboot them.
Now, when you say upgrade a network, is this upgrading underlying like physical infrastructure?
Switches and
Okay.
And it may not be just upgrades, network outages, or things like that.
Maybe even reconfiguration or something, I imagine.
Yeah, I haven't gotten enough into the details. We've seen this enough that we're trying to monitor for it now. So I haven't got to exactly the root details, other than we know that what ends up happening is it's a similar thing when we're talking about vCenter being disconnected from like one of the hosts. One of the hosts goes disconnected. The VMs are still running, but it can't talk back. And so that storage that's part of the vSAN also is disconnected at that time. And so vSAN says, hey, my storage policy isn't being met right now. So something's not right. And I don't know how vSAN's handling that, but to the VM, it looks like the storage is not responsive. And after a certain amount of time, it marks it read-only to protect its data. And this is out there. It's not anything really Kubernetes specific. Like you can just see this running VMs in VMware that's its. So there's some like workarounds people have talked about, which is basically not telling your operating system to not go read only. But then the longer you do that, the more you could end up with corrupted data and then having to rebuild the VM. So we've only had to rebuild a VM a couple times. Most of the time after the reboot, it may need an FSCK that's forced to fix things. But it does go back to how is vSAN handling those type of network outages? Is it storage policy that?
I don't think storage policy would be involved with this, but I'm speculating. And this seems like an issue where maybe you'd want some authoritative thing running at the network layer that polices health. Because what you've got going on, both Kubernetes and vSAN and vSphere to some extent have observability into what they're observing in terms of networking functionality. And should they conclude that there are issues, might put themselves in a reduced functionality mode as a safeguard.
Yeah. So what you're describing, and yeah, this is we're in vSAN product mode now. I mean, what you're describing is either like a split cluster scenario, or this happening to objects that have a storage policy that only has that has no redundancy, basically. So if I have
to look at how the storage policy is, but I'm pretty sure they're saying, hey, yes, if any of these hosts go down, then you're violating the storage policy. But there are more than one. There's more than one host. There's
yeah, but so if I make a storage policy that has no redundancy, what I'm telling vSAN to do is whatever objects are attached to this storage policy, only save them once somewhere in the vSAN cluster. That doesn't necessarily mean it's on the same host.
Oh, okay. So no, there is redundancy here.
Okay. So in normal situations, right? And I'm not talking about things like stretched cluster. So single vSAN cluster that's all local. Let's say it's in one rack. I mean, for one, the communication between the hosts, right? That vSAN uses it uses a dedicated. Well, you can set the ESX host to use a dedicated VM kernel port for all that communication, and the physical side of that should always be redundant, right? So hopefully you'll never get in a situation where you'll get a dual network outage that kills both paths. That would completely disrupt the communication between ESX hosts for vSAN and for everything else, right? Because vSAN communication is one way these hosts in a cluster talk to each other, just to replicate vSAN storage objects. But another one is the VM kernel network, and the network they're communicating over to send each other HA pings, right? So you can have setups where that's all using the same VM kernel port, or you can split it all out and then have even dedicated NICs associated with dedicated VM kernel ports for specific types of channels. For high throughput or specialized kind of vSAN scenarios, you might have that. You might have special NICs that are just for the storage traffic, or you want all your storage traffic to run over a separate network. You do separate NICs for that. And you'd have a separate VM kernel port for that. So there's lots of different ways this can fail, but it does kind of sound like you're already running into a situation where you're getting a dual network failure. Both paths are down, which shouldn't really happen, right? That's not healthy. So when that happens, when ESX hosts in a vSAN cluster lose communication with each other, you can end up with a split cluster, where storage objects for VMs might be on these hosts, and the VMs in themselves are on the other hosts. In that case, when that happens, you'll get the behavior you're describing, where certain VMs will go read-only because vSAN has no way to guarantee writes. So it'll just shut off their storage. Now,
And that does match, it will match the situation where we'll have a cluster. And say you have 6 Kubernetes nodes in there, you may only have one of them go to read-only, or 2 of them go read-only, or you could have all of them go read-only. Like
so the things that go read-only are the storage objects, right? So and the storage objects in most ESX
when I said read-only, I meant
disks, right?
when I said read-only, I meant the file system read-only of the VMs, which yes depends on the storage objects. And I'm not sure if like everything to your point, like that could be that this VM, all of its storage is on its local host, so it's still good to go.
Yeah, but it might not be, right? Because
Yeah.
without stretch cluster, without defining specific failure domains, you don't know which storage object is on which ESX host. It pulls them all together because the network is assumed to be fast enough to just, you could have the 2 mirrors of a particular VM's disk sitting on host 3 and 4, while the VM that they belong to is sitting on host 1. And in those cases, if you get network failure, you'll get what you described. The VM will be put read-only. Now, one of the ways you can, I can't remember if this is default behavior or not, but VMware HA has a role to play here. VMware HA can be configured to deal with situations like this. You can have, I believe, it's been a while since I worked with vSAN, you can have VMs be forcefully shut down when they enter a state like this. So they have no addressable storage because there's been a split in your cluster. HA can turn those VMs off, which is sometimes far safer.
Okay, so yeah, I get what you're saying. And rather than wait for it to get marked read-only, it shuts it down until
shuts it down because there's no addressable storage anymore. I have no contact with the storage objects in vSAN. The VM goes off. It just kills them instantly. This is what happens if you do stretch cluster and you have a vSAN cluster stretch over 2 physical locations with a witness. This is one of the behavior modes you can set. You can say like, if there is a network split between my 2 data centers, I want the witness to say for these storage objects, always let data center 1 survive, kill everything immediately in data center 2 so I don't get data corruption. So now you can set vSphere HA to behave similarly just in one single local vSAN cluster, I believe. So you kind of want to look into those options. But
does it have the option to start it up when storage becomes available?
Yes, because HA will try to restart any VMs that it can. That's its default behavior, but it will only be able to succeed if the storage is available for those VMs to be able to start them. It requires that at least one of the mirrors of such a storage object is available. So the moment it can reach the mirror, one of the parts, say all the objects are just mirrored, it'll boot those VMs. So that's VMware HA will try to do that. But which version of vSphere is this?
It is, I think mostly these are 7.0.
Yeah.
I'm not sure which update version.
But the fact that you're already getting in a situation where you're getting a dual network failure, that's already pretty bad. I mean, it's.
I agree.
It's not an assumption that vSAN makes, right?
That shouldn't be happening. And knowing the setup of these, like, I'm not sure how we get into that situation and not have it on all of them.
Yeah.
But anyways, that's I'm trying to track down. We have a different team that manages the network updates and the network support, and so we're adding in an alert that's going to start telling us when this is happening, so we can track more. Because in the past, like the elite alerts we had with Alert Manager, Prometheus, like they actually required it to be written to disk to alert on it. And if it's read-only and it can't do that, it doesn't alert that that's a read-only file system. So you have to have something running in memory already that's checking those things. But anyways, yeah, so I'm trying to gather more data, but that is an issue we're trying to track down. So.
And how big are these clusters? Just curious. I mean, how many ESX hosts?
ESX hosts, 3. But most of the time it's 3.
Right. Okay. Interesting. I mean, you made me very curious. I'm in troubleshooting mode now. But the next step would have to be to look at your environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe if we're going to do a best practices guide, Bryson, you could, we don't have to do it in this meeting, but if you can throw out sort of lists of representative examples, like in your case, 3 cluster nodes and what you've got set up for networking, whether it's redundant and what is being used to achieve the redundancy and what type of storage you have. It would help us architect some kind of a best practices guide, because I think that the best practices is going to be highly dependent on what your underlying platform looks like.
Yeah, I think Scott made some points though, that there's some, our use case is actually, I mean, pretty generic as far as persistent volumes go. I mean, we want them to work, but if it went down for a few minutes but came back up, it'd be fine. We're not running like a database on it that's going to be really impactful. So it's probably the simplest one to get best practices for.
What I've seen, I don't know if this helps, what I've seen from the TKGS documentation, so vSphere with Tanzu, is that they don't put forward a best practice so explicitly around vSAN. What they simply do is they assume the vSAN defaults, and the vSAN default is a storage policy that just does failure to tolerate as 1, so it mirrors every object. That's the assumption they make in their documentation, and I mean, what they're doing there is basically it's like the 80-20 rule, right? For most vSAN clusters out there, that default vSAN storage policy FTT is 1 is enough for most workloads, most generic workloads.
And honestly, that default would probably not limit us on things, but it's not as safe.
Well, so in a 3-node vSAN cluster, you couldn't do anything more than FTT is 1, because you don't have enough hosts to replicate storage objects more than once. So I believe that if you said FTT is 2, so failure to tolerate is 2, you'd need at least 5 ESX hosts for that policy to even work.
And I'm not saying for that necessarily policy, but I think the thing I've taken away from today's conversations is we probably need, so we have a team that manages the VMware side of things. And so they set up the storage policy, but that's for just all their VMs. So the thing I've taken away from today is I probably need to go and say, hey, well, maybe that storage policy doesn't work for our persistent volumes. Maybe it needs to be different for our persistent volumes and have a different storage policy by use case. So
yeah, maybe, but like I said, if it's just 3 ESX hosts, there's not much you can do. That you can't replicate more than what that default policy would do. You have no, there's in a 3 host cluster is very small. It's the minimum size for vSAN. You don't have many options there. You couldn't really mess around with that storage policy all too much. I mean, you can turn encryption on and off and things like that, but there's
Yeah, effectively, it's either on or off, like one
Yeah, in
choice
this
of
case,
redundancy or no
with just 3
redundancy.
hosts is either on or off. Yeah.
The only other thing you could do, and this is, this isn't quite the same thing, but have backups. That would be another orthogonal measure of this that is just kind of an ugly way to roll back to some point in time if things went really bad. But
Do you guys have something to back up persistent volumes?
See, we don't actually, the backups don't matter as much as just data being cached. So we're using this as like a cache. So if there's an issue, we can blow it away. And so we can scale down the pod, blow away the PV, scale it back up, create a new PV, and be moving. So that is one of the workarounds. Like, hey, if you can't move this over, if this host is disconnected for a certain amount of time and we can't get that fixed, then we just blow away the PV and rebuild and move on, and it'll start caching things again.
I'm just kind of wondering whether your vSphere guys didn't set the storage policy to FTT as 0 for this cluster. Because
why
that
they
would,
didn't set it to 0?
Hmm?
Why you're asking why they wouldn't set it to 0?
Well, I'm just wondering if they might have set it to FTT as
No,
0.
I know they didn't do that.
Okay.
I know that when we're talking about storage, everything I put in there's duplicated, so it takes up twice as much storage. So
Okay.
I know they
Okay.
have that.
Because if they had, or someone had, that would explain why you get these persistent volume disconnect situations so often.
But if we had 2 of those hosts, those VMware hosts, become disconnected from the cluster, like from
Yeah,
from vCenter.
In a 3-node, so there's 2 different things, right?
There's 2 different things. That's what I'm saying from vCenter. If we have 2 of those hosts become disconnected from vCenter, would that lead to more of this type of situation then?
So there's 2 things that are separate. Hosts disconnecting from vCenter is not the same as hosts disconnecting from each other.
Right.
vSAN can only function if the hosts talk to each other. They don't need vSAN doesn't need vCenter.
It doesn't need vCenter.
No. If you disconnect vCenter, the hosts can still talk to each other. vSAN will work fine. You can't change anything in the configuration. For that, you need vCenter. But vSAN will continue working normally. Even vSphere HA will continue to work normally.
But you could have times where maybe the reason they're disconnected from vCenter is because they're just disconnected.
Yeah. And if you have a 3-host cluster and 2 hosts die, vSAN is dead because it loses quorum and everything goes read-only. Right? In a 3-node vSAN cluster, you can only ever lose 1. Anything more, and vSAN will simply stop working. And
How does it react to it? You say it goes read-only until one comes back?
Yeah, it'll set everything to read-only because it has no quorum. It can't.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm just not really aware of how vSAN handles that. So, and that might be what's happening. So it might be a network thing. 2 of the nodes are affected. And that could be getting us to the point where, hey, if you don't have your copy at least on one of the nodes, well, actually, at that point, everything would be read-only.
Everything goes read-only because
that's probably that might be the situation where we get all of our VMs read-only.
Yes.
Because
even if there was still one normal working vSAN node, it would still stop because it has no quorum. It needs 3. Well, it needs 2 at least to work.
It needs 2.
Yeah, it needs 2. Yeah, and 3 to be healthy.
I've been wondering here, Bryson, is vSAN the best option for your storage for this thing? Because if on your cluster you're running into this regularly, are you able to re-architect this app to use something more memory-based like Redis or something like that?
Well, this we're in the process of moving this out of Kubernetes.
Well, okay, then you have other things to
So,
focus on.
so that we don't even have to worry about this. So we're moving the cache out of Kubernetes so then we can rebuild the cluster from, I mean, essentially it's the cache for images. So if you're trying to pull your images and you can't reach the external endpoint, you need something local to be able to pull those to keep everything running if it's disconnected. And so this has been caching our images, but if we rebuild the cluster and it's cached externally to the cluster, then it helps rebuild the cluster faster. So we're looking at that, but generally these issues have just become more and more, and the average user probably wouldn't have as big an issue with this, but when you have thousands of clusters you're managing, that one issue becomes a bigger issue. You see it more.
So when you move them out of Kubernetes, what are you moving them to? Just residing in VMs or
It'd be
bare
an
metal or?
a VM. I mean, it was, in fact, we still may have this issue with read-only file systems. But we move out of some of those issues I discussed earlier.
Yeah, there are certainly less layers to troubleshoot and things too, so it would be simpler. Okay, we're nearing the top of the hour. Does anybody else have any last minute topics they want to bring up? I think we'll queue this up for a future meeting. I can't promise it'll be the very next one, but at some point in the future, we'll get into a topic of best practices for storage for persistent applications. Maybe it will be VMware specific, but a lot of what's covered here might be generic to just using Kubernetes in general. So anybody got last call for something for today's meeting? And similarly, if you have suggestions for the meeting next month or the month after that, throw it out there. Okay, thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you at the next one. Last minute advisory, there is going to be a KubeCon North America held in mid-October. It's available both physical and online. And Miles and I will be presenting at that. If anybody is intending to attend physically, definitely track me down, because I'd like to try to get it back to the old world where at the physical KubeCons, we attempted to have the user group people who were present engage socially for a meet and greet. And I don't know if anybody but me will even be there, but I'll try. And if anybody on this call intends to be there, definitely direct message me and we'll try to get in touch while we're there. Bye, everybody.